So I thought I would just briefly talk about how I feel about Reform UK and British politics at the moment. I think, like most people, we've all, or anybody that's kind of anti-lib lab con politics in the last decade or 15 to 20 years, let's say, has been looking for an alternative, and certainly anybody that's been disillusioned with politics over the last few years. As more and more people have been heading towards the right, further to the right of politics. At one time, a lot of people would have been quite happy to support the Conservative Party and or more conservative policies, let's say. But even Labour, really, a lot of people were quite happy to vote Labour. Certainly when I was growing up in the 90s, noughties. But it's only really, I think, now that we're truly feeling the disastrous effects of failed economic policies, failed immigration policy. Well, then it wasn't really a failure, it was a deliberate attempt to kind of sabotage the country in many ways. Kind of like reverse colonialism, if you will. But I think a lot of people have been looking for something, probably over the last 30 years or so, that might have the answers to a lot of the problems that the UK has, or certainly England. I didn't grow up in Scotland or Ireland or Wales, but certainly in England, there's been a hell of a lot of problems over the last few decades. With unemployment, with just really a kind of in many more kind of, I don't like using that word poorer, but economically deprived, socially deprived areas of the north of the country, really. But really, but nowadays, it's pretty much just about everywhere now. As when I was growing up, it was where I grew up anyway. There was a lot of problems there, and it's just been getting worse, just worse and worse over the decades. And that's partly why I decided that there came a point where I just saw that things were just deteriorating further and further, and just more degradation of everything, and just the way that society was just kind of changing overall, really. Just people were getting worse, and it was just becoming more and more dog eat dog, really. It was becoming more. There was just more and more inequality, more and more stigmatization of certain people. It just seemed to be more and more divide, really. It just seemed to be just too much politics involved in everything. And I think a lot of people have been seeing that over the last few decades, and as a result, people have been wanting something to come along and save them, their families, their closest ones, their loved ones, and from the ills of incompetence, corruption, and greed, really. And so it doesn't surprise me that people fell for the likes of the BNP and the National Front, and then sort of later on became a bit more sterilised and a bit more a bit more professional, let's say, and effective at potentially having any kind of chance of governing, with the likes of, say, things like UKIP. You could even say, to some extent, even Britain First, potentially. But certainly I would say that UKIP probably could have gained, I suspect, if it hadn't been such a victim of 15, 20 years or so of smearing and slander, and being dragged through the gutter thanks to the media, then I think it would have it could have potentially got to a point where it could have maybe formed a government, maybe with the help of the God Saves. Maybe I don't know. I don't know. Maybe even could have even formed a government in and of itself. I don't know, but. So it does, naturally, since UKIP and what have we had? We've had the Brexit Party that was, here today, gone tomorrow. It was incredibly short-lived, and that obviously morphed into reform. And the way that reforms, I mean, I was always kind of suspicious anyway of. I've had my. I've had my doubts about Farage. To me, it's just too much of a. It's too much of a ego. Really, it's too. He likes to be centre stage of everything, and it always has to be about him and what he thinks, what he says, and I've never really. I can respect the man in certain ways, but I certainly don't like the man, and I think a lot of people fell into this difficult position of wanting to believe him for the sake of, a potential, centre right or just slightly off centre right party would come along and potentially, change things up and. Shake the foundations of the establishment and everything. And I think a lot of people felt that, even though they had reservations about Farage, they felt probably that they had to kind of put the trust in him, even if they didn't particularly like him, and kind of saw through him in certain ways because it was for the greater good in the long term. But I think over the last couple of weeks now, whatever it's been, what has it been, 2 weeks or something, just about since the Rupert Lowe thing. I think I could be wrong. Maybe it's just been a week. I don't know. I'm losing track of time these days. But I think a lot of people fell for it. People fell for this essentially a kind of, a slightly. Maybe in some ways a kind of slightly better version than UKIP in terms of its kind of. Language and its campaigning and so-called professionalism and the types of people that it attracted. Obviously it has had some issues as well, but I think compared to UKIP, it seemed for a while to have more potential than. I mean, UKIP's dead anyway. It's been dead for years, and I don't think. I mean, who knows? A lot of things can happen in politics, as we all know, and but I suspect probably that UKIP's not going to be coming back into the limelight anytime soon. But that's just my opinion. But who knows? The guy in charge, I can't remember his name now. It's surname Nick something. I think that's his name. It seems like a decent man. Seems like he's got a good head on his shoulders, smart, articulate. But also, I kind of get the impression he's on. Maybe also might be some kind of controlled opposition in a sense, perhaps. I almost feel that the establishment tolerate the likes of Reform and UKIP and Britain First and sort of what they call the fringe parties, because those kind of parties, even though they obviously are adamantly against them. In so many different ways, they see them as a kind of, barrier. They sort of stop, they prevent essentially, the genuine, real, actual, extreme types of people, from kind of getting anywhere really. But I mean, really, if they could, if that wasn't the case, they wouldn't have the likes of Brit First and UKIP and. There's other ones out there as well, but there's most of them. Nobody's really ever heard of them, really. So, you know, the main ones are really like UKIP and Britain First, as far as the so-called fringe parties, which is it's not technically true. I mean, certainly in UKIP's case, it actually had quite a bit of success in the early to mid 2010s. But really, ever since Brexit, since Farage stepped back from the party and it got, what was his name, Henry Bolton, I think his name, what he took over it, instead of the person that should have took over it, which was Anne-Marie Waters, but never mind. You know, I think if she'd have been allowed to take the party forward, I personally think that the party would have had a much better chance of gaining back some respect from the public, really, in many ways. But Anne-Marie was essentially a targeted woman in many ways. She didn't stand a chance, unfortunately, which is very sad, because she probably could have been one of the greatest PMs, really, in my opinion. I genuinely believe, I really mean that. But she had no chance. She was just up against, essentially, you know, the more easy, less controversial options for leadership of UKIP. But anyway, so essentially what we've ended up in a place where, because of the damage done to UKIP's image, and also because of the fact that essentially the UK is made up of, you know, yes, it is a liberal society in many respects, but it's also still quite a heavily conservative, reserved nation in many ways. Certainly with, I'd say, people over, let's say, the age of, say, 40, 50, I'd say probably the vast majority of people in the UK will be quite lean towards either in or lean towards more conservative values. Whereas the rest, the younger generation, they're probably more sort of towards, you know, sort of more kind of, I guess, you know, like the more sort of progressive woke type kind of ideas and philosophy and that kind of stuff, I'm guessing. But of course, you know, there's obviously exceptions, and there's a lot of older, you know, middle-aged people, older people that support so-called progressivism and DEI and all that kind of stuff. But I'd say probably more. I'd say there's probably a good 65. I'd say about 65-70% of the country probably that's probably either quite conservative or fairly conservative, or overall, I'd say. And the only real reason, as we all know, that Labour won the last general election is because hardly anybody went out to vote. You know, they really didn't. They won by the skin of the teeth, really, in many ways. It's only because essentially a lot of people voted for Labour as essentially a kind of fuck you to the Conservatives, I suppose, in many ways. It's not that a lot of people were particularly in favour of Labour or wanted a Labour government, but I think after such a long period of time of 14 years of conservative governments, I think just some people were just so fed up that they were just like, you know, let's just give them a chance. Let's just, you know, things can't get any worse, and they have. So you know, you reap what you sow and all that. So it's I never believed that you know, when all that happened last year, and Reform was kind of riding on this high of, you know, they was getting quite popular in the polls, and obviously they won. Farage won his Clacton seat, and you know, he had what's it called? What's the word? Is it deflections from the Conservatives? Obviously, he had Lee Anderson's one of the main ones. I think you've had a few others as well. You know, I think there was a time, you know, around and just after the time of the general election where a lot of people were looking at Reform and thinking, you know, wow, they've achieved quite a lot here. They've done really well. You know, they've got 5 MPs and, you know, seem to have a lot of potential. But I think a lot of people also had a lot of reservations and were quite pessimistic about reform, and I know I certainly have been, because you know, when you listen to the likes of people like Richard Tice and Farage, you know, these are ex, you know, they're ex, I mean, well, to some extent they still are businessmen, really. And you know, if there's one thing I've come to realise, especially when it comes to politics, is that you can't trust anybody, really. But I probably can't trust certain businessman types, probably more so than people who haven't been in business. You know, the politics seems to attract all sorts of different toxic personality types in my analysis of it, my experience. You know, for what it's worth, but I just think that, you know, if people were so desperate, people were so crying out for change, people were so utterly frustrated with everything, and had been for, you know, probably since the 80s, 70s, 80s, really, that of course, you know, people are going to latch on to the next best thing, you know, the next, you know, sort of wave of populism and things like this. It's kind of just human nature to you know, cling on to what you think might be the saving grace of the day, and unfortunately, what we've realised, and I've known this for a while anyway, is that reform's kind of essentially just a, you know, a 2.0 version of the Conservatives, really. And you can't trust Tice, Farage, Youssef, the chairman of the party, as far as you could throw these people. So I personally, I have absolutely no faith in reform. And you know, it's funny how they've in recent months, you know, just gradually since the election, they've just kind of been, you know, strategic, and that's what it is, sort of mellowing out a little bit and kind of being more careful with the rhetoric and kind of censoring themselves, and you know, kind of becoming very, very sterilised as a party in many ways. And you know, there's just excessive push to not be seen as, you know, an old UKIP or, you know, some far right entity or something, which nobody really thought that anyway. But you know, this is where we are in the UK. We've got this. You've got this establishment of, you know, well-educated, you know, wealthy, middle-class and upper-class types that, you know, they want to dictate the rules because they think they know everything. They think that they've got more authority and more you know, more morals and rights and guidance on everything than everybody else, because they've been to some top universities or whatever. And you know, what we're left is really is, you know, it's just a class divide. It's class warfare. That's what this kind of progressivism stuff's essentially been about. It's a small minority of, you know, very well educated, very well off types of people that feel morally superior than everybody else, especially towards the working classes of the country. And by that I mean, you know, in the northeast of the country. And so, you know, it doesn't surprise me when you have the likes of like Richard Tice and Farage. I mean, essentially they only really got into politics out of their own selfish needs, really. You know, and that really applies, I think, probably more than anything else to business and wanting to make more money and to try and fight towards less legislation and things like that, so it would benefit them and help them to make more profits in terms of running businesses and things like that. Excuse me. I mean, that, look, I don't know, I don't have all the insights on everything, obviously, but that's just my take on it. You know, these are businessmen. That's all they are. You know, they've got into it out of their own. They have an agenda, and the way I see people like the way I see, if personally, I think Reform are done. I think they've wiped away any potential of a chance of real governance in the near future. In my opinion, I think that with the you know, doing away with people like Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe, probably two of the best people that they could have possibly gotten, and who had fought incredibly hard for reform and stood by Farage and Tyson. Obviously, they had a lot of differences, but tried to do things diplomatically, maturely, sensibly. You know, to get rid of people like that, you're just committing. Farage just shot himself in the foot, really, and I knew that it's a scam, really. As far as I'm concerned, it's just you know, you're talking about a party that if they had their way, they'd essentially be running a kind of, you know, what do they call it, like a feudal, or how do you say it? Is it feudalism based kind of society, really? That you know, that you're talking about people that see the working classes as collateral damage. You know, they see us as means to an end kind of thing. You know, that they are pawns. You know, they are, disposable individuals in society. And so you'd essentially be living under a kind of, a neo-feudalist state, really, with more and more wealth in even smaller hands, and the return of serfdom kind of culture and all that kind of thing. In the if you can vision that in the modern era. So, I mean, it's just kind of essentially what you've got anywhere in many ways, with big corporations and big companies, big banks, and dictating all the rules, and it's very small. Number of organisations that hold pretty much most of the money in the country, besides entrepreneurs, of course. Although obviously some of those are people that are heavily involved in setting up companies that could become corporations that become morally bankrupt over time, and end up in all sorts of unethical, illegal shenanigans and corruption. But so I personally don't have any trust in the reform at all. I've basically, I just kind of, just over the last few months, my skepticism, my pessimism over Farage has just been kind of growing, really, and I think a lot of people have been feeling like that. It's not just the fact that he always has to be in the spotlight. I could kind of look past that, but it's his. When you really think back, when you think through it all, there's a reason why UKIP fell to shit. There's a reason why he wanted to distance himself from the Brexit Party. Why he stepped back from reform, and because he knows deep down that he is the problem. He knows that he's the one that's holding the country back in many ways, because he's too much of a narcissist. He's too self-absorbed. He's an egomaniac. He comes across as a bit of a sociopath, actually, and I think he doesn't think about it. The guy likes to be in the spotlight. He's on GB News every few days, whatever. He's always at the head of these, in front of these. The image of these conferences, reform conference, everything. He's just someone that likes. He's got his head up his own arse. He likes the smell of his own farts. He likes people saying his name, and his name being splattered over posters and campaigns and things all over the country when he's going around the country pretending that he's somehow trying to come across as if he's got some real alliance with the working classes, or the guy's middle class, well-to-do type. He was educated at a pretty good school. So he made quite a bit of money in London when he was a young man, and he's obviously known some people with a lot of money, and he's had connections, and the more I think about it, and I hear people talking about it all the time about him being controlled opposition, and I think there might be a lot of truth to that, actually, and it would make a lot of sense. It's like people respect him because he's done a lot of things, and granted he was a key player in the push towards a referendum for Brexit, and obviously Brexit happening, and the so-called negotiations, in inverted commas, that happened with May and others in the UK government since 2016. So, but it's just I think people respect him in certain ways, but they're also incredibly they see him as a necessary tool, but also a chink in the armor kind of thing. Like they see him as a necessary kind of a defense, like a kind of a barrier almost. Like, I mean, he even said it himself that he tried to defeat the British National Party, probably in the 90s, early 90s, whatever it was, when Nick Griffin, I think that's his name, was in charge of it, unless I've got it wrong. So and so I think people in high places have picked up on that. They've seen that they can use him, and that they can use him in some ways, let him have a certain, let him get to a certain point kind of thing, but no further than that. But that's just my assessment of the whole thing, really. As far as Tice goes, I mean, I think really once Tice said that, what's now become quite a well-known quote, all those lot, or whatever he said, it was sort of a paraphrasing probably, or something along those lines, basically referring to anybody that had any kind of support for Tommy Robinson. Once he, I mean, I knew anyway. I've known for a while that he was, he's a stuffy-nosed kind of, pompous, kind of typical look down the noses at the working class type, middle class wanker, basically. And I've met people like that in my life, so I know I know what they are when I come across them. And essentially, Farage is the same thing. He's just good at. It's really a chameleon. Really, he knows how to be charming, and he knows how to make people think that he's something that he's not really. He's really just it's essentially just a mouthpiece in a sense, in a way, for the government, in a way, and that's why I think what people respect him and people are using him, really, and he doesn't mind it as long as the money's rolling in. I don't really genuinely think he cares about the things that he talks about anymore. Maybe he did at one time, but I think now it's just a big money maker, especially with his role on GB News, and he came back into the limelight for one reason only, and that was just to get his seat in Clacton. That was all it really was. He came back because he had he said that he felt a sense of guilt. It's just it's bullshit. It's just the guy knew that he had a good chance of winning a seat. He's essentially just a kind of, as far as I can tell at least, he is just he's just a I don't know. I just don't trust the guy, really. I really don't, and I really mean it. I just think that he's, he's playing he's playing a long game. I think that's just my take on it all. I don't think that he's. I think probably in terms of Brexit and things like that, I think he probably had some kind of desire to achieve his agenda and things like that, and he probably was more driven, and he probably was more actually engaged with the things it was talking about. But I think ever since Brexit, I think ever since he kind of he's known that none of that's ever really going to get anywhere. He's just essentially kind of playing conservative light mode, and that's why I'll never have any faith in him, and I'll never trust him, and I'll never really truly ever believe anything that he ever says ever again. And with the treatment of Ben Habib, the treatment of Rupert Lowe, the guy just doesn't deserve your energy, doesn't deserve your time. And as far as I'm concerned, the sooner reform disappears, and I hope Ben and Rupert come together and form some kind of an alliance or some new movement, a political party, the better, because we're seeing exactly what reform is now. We're seeing exactly what people like Tyson Farage are. They're just phony con men, cutthroat businessmen types that couldn't give a fuck about anybody else but themselves. So as far as I'm concerned, the sooner reform fucks off and dies, the better. And bring on the real, actual centre-right movement, or whatever's needed to get Britain back to a place, respectable, sustainable, stable country that actually has its morals intact, its values intact, for the first time in, say, 50 or so years. Let's say, however it's going to work, whether that's going to be through political means or some kind of mass, strikes or protests, or a combination to, I don't know, but it seems inevitable in the coming years that something has to give, and I hope that the chain of events that lead to some kind of explosion of enthusiasm, passion, and hope for the country starts with the decline and eventual demise of reform. And anyway, that's just my opinion on the whole lot. So going forwards, I wouldn't put any trust in reform. If you have to, vote for independence. And just always be wary of people like Farage and Tyson, these people, these saviour types, these messiah types, as Farage is being called now, because they're often wolves in sheep's clothing. So politics is a very dirty, manipulative, corrupt game, and people like Tyson Farage, they fit right into it. So they're getting exactly what they deserve, as far as I'm concerned.